Phil.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just keen to draw out some of the costs and impacts of policing these protests. We've already had some figures mentioned earlier in questioning, but I just wonder, just to set the scene, could you talk us through, so when a protest is announced, we're looking at figures of 100,000 people roughly, sometimes more, sometimes less. What's the process that you go through to make sure you've got sufficient numbers of officers policing the protest in the control room, other people who will be supporting you, getting them there, drawing from other forces? What does that look like?
So, one thing to start with is that the Met Police is well experienced, or very experienced at dealing with sort of complex protests and major events. But it's fair to say that the tempo and the pressure that these events week in, week out have had has been extraordinary, even for a sort of well-resourced organisation that's capable of dealing with it. So when we get the information, when we get told that there's going to be a protest, a command team will be appointed, and they will then look at what the things like what the organisers want to do. There'll be a discussion as to what the route will be. There'll be a discussion as to what the organisers expect in terms of numbers, and that always isn't known because, as I mentioned earlier, the organisers don't have a great deal of control over the numbers, and sometimes they'll think several 100,000 will turn up and they won't, and other times they'll think 50,000 will turn up and more will come. And then we look at what our strategic intentions are, and very clearly, in terms of these protests in particular, given the level of fear in communities, given the crimes that we have seen consistently, we need to be able to take more assertive action, so that requires more resources. We need to be able to identify, or firstly, look to prevent crime, and we're doing that by things like giving out leaflets, having people at the assembly points looking to spot people, using evidence gatherers and intelligence teams based around an assembly point. We then need a capability to intervene if crimes are seen. So that requires having significant numbers of officers at different points along the route ready to intervene if our Voyager teams who are monitoring the CCTV actually spot people. And then actually, at the end of any march and assembly, we need an ability to ensure there's an effective dispersal. And one of the things that's been very clear is that the overwhelming vast majority of those who attend these marches disperse on their own very quickly, and impressively so actually. But also, the flip side of that is that every week we have seen smaller groups, several hundred strong, looking to hang around, looking to march around the West End, causing antisocial behaviour, using flares, using fireworks, looking for confrontation. And so we need to resource it sufficiently to make sure that we can now deal with that. And one of the things that we focus on is our legal framework. And over the span of time of these marches, we've used more and more of our legal framework to the point where I think we are using the maximum in terms of imposing preconditions under Section 12 of the Public Order Act, Section 14 of the Public Order Act in relation to the assemblies. We're using Section 60 and 60AA in terms of the wearing of face coverings and asking people to remove it. And then at the end of an assembly, once the stated end time of the protest has happened, we're using Section 35 dispersal orders to prevent that crime and disorder we've seen. So all of that points to, as the Chair and Mr Loughton will have seen on the weekend, points to an incredibly resource-intensive operation. And on a day-to-day basis, you're talking about around between 2,000 and 3,000 officers being needed just for that. If you take everything, including road closures, identification, charge centres, investigators, as well as the public order officers that are actually deployed on the ground, it's much, much bigger than that.
Thank you. And we will come back on potential need for new legislation as well. But just in terms of direct impact then, so that's a significant number of officers. What's the split between Metropolitan Police officers, so when we're policing in London, and officers you've drawn down from elsewhere in the country?
So we try, insofar as we can, not to pull people in from the rest of the country, and mutual aid, whilst a very well-established sort of protocol nationally, is something we should only use when we really need it. But we have really needed it a number of times, and what we have done is every other weekend, when there's been a national call-out, since mid-November, we've been calling on 20 PSUs, which is 20 groups of officers, so round about 450 odd officers to come in and assist. So it probably on a busy day, it makes up between a sort of fifth and a quarter of our overall resourcing for the national call-outs. The impact on the Met is also significant. And so all of the officers that we're using on this are officers who would otherwise be policing communities, who would otherwise be doing proactive taskings, who would otherwise be dealing with crime or investigations. And on some weekends, we've had to move our response teams, our neighbourhood teams, and some of our proactive teams onto 12-hour shifts, because if you move all of your borough-based resources onto 12-hour shifts, it frees up a shift of people that you can bring in. But that isn't without cost, that isn't without impact on the officers who, having done this for many weeks now, are tired. And I think the final point to say is that what we are doing now is we're looking to spread the impact across the wider organisation. So within the Met, we have about 3,500 what I would say public order trained officers, level 2 officers, and they are the ones who have been doing the majority of this. So there's a small number who are doing a disproportionate amount. So we are looking to officers that are in other roles, in supporting roles, spread across the whole organisation, as to how others might be able to lean in and backfill those people so they can get some time off.
You led me, thank you for that, you've led me very neatly to my next question there, which is the operational impact for other parts of policing within London. So obviously if they're policing protests, they are not doing something else, but do you have metrics on what that looks like? So what is not being addressed? How many crimes are not going answered as a result of these protests?
So we're tracking our performance now and are paying keen attention to things like neighbourhood crime. We've seen an increase in robbery recently. We've seen an increase across a number of our neighbourhood crime metrics. And at the moment, it's too early to say, is that because we've abstracted lots of people and there's fewer officers in communities? But the analysis on that is being done. I think it's logical to think that if we're abstracting many officers and bringing them into central London to deal with these protests, then there will be an impact elsewhere.
I think the Chief Constable wants to come in on that point as well, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick points in support of what AC Twister's been saying, particularly with resources. And the question about process, when that mutual aid is requested, that goes through the National Police Coordination Centre. We will then look at what our resourcing level is, and that request is made of all forces across the country. The process we're going through there is to try and make sure we balance that region by region, so a single force is not adversely affected in a disproportionate way to others. I think Matt has described the situation in the Met very well. I think the key for the Met here is not about their ability and the number of resources they've got, but it is about the well-being of their officers. So Matt has plenty of resources he could use week in, week out, but we need to think about the well-being of our officers and how we do that. And then in terms of that ongoing effect on normal policing, that effect is seen across all of our forces. If we put people into mutual aid or into policing protests, they are coming from our neighbourhood teams, from our response teams. We are seeing a denudation of some of our resourcing and resilience on day-to-day business. And then if you take into account the investigative burden that comes with an uplift of 680% rise in anti-Semitic crime that needs investigating and is being investigated. So far across the country there's been 649 arrests for faith hate crime related to this anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crime. That again is a burden on it, as well as a burden around our custody suites, charging process, criminal justice process and into court. So the knock-on impact here is quite significant. Whether we can actually evidence where that impact is being felt at the moment, because we're only two and a half months into this, is very difficult, but it will be a piece of analysis that we work through over the coming months, and particularly as we move hopefully into a return to normality and recovery phase in the operation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I was just wondering to both of you whether you might be able to share that analysis with us when it's complete, so we can get a picture of what the impact is.
In due course, and I think things like the leadership capacity, the reform that we're trying to do, particularly in the Met, the impact on local officers, the budget, because I mentioned a figure earlier, but that's only going to rise, and that's already on a very pressured budget. Crime and fatigue are all the sort of the key issues that we're going to be looking at.
Thank you. And just one more question on this for me, if you don't mind. Obviously, you're cancelling a lot of leave at the moment. You are moving resource around. When these protests come to an end, as we hope they will, do you have an estimate of what the impact's going to be as a result of trying to backfill that leave and giving your officers the time off that they deserve?
That's a really good question. I mean, so far, 5,500 rest days have been cancelled. So those are 5,500 rest days that people are owed that we need to give them an opportunity to take. And it's also fair to say that at the moment, whilst we've had some welcome news that we don't think there's going to be any major protests now before the start of January, this isn't over. So this is continuing. There are going to be further protests in January, it seems, and I say whilst it's welcome news, it is, but I also caveat that with events, geopolitical events, might well change that. So one of the things we're sort of having to do is to be able to respond to short notice, as well as the big set pieces on a weekend. We're also having to be able to respond to short notice protests, whether that be in local communities or whether that be in Whitehall. So that requires us to have more officers ready than otherwise would be the case. But I think the impact is significant, and it's not over yet. So that 5,500 rest days is going to increase.
Thank you. And Chief Constable, sorry, you've got your hand up. Same question.
Yeah, so just again, on a national level, similar picture, whilst the scale of it isn't quite the same as the Metropolitan. Of the 2,200 officers deployed on mutual aid, a large proportion of those will be on cancelled rest days to maintain resilience within forces. So those will all have to be either honoured or paid back at some point in the future. Those will also entail significant overtime because of the hours that they'll have been working through those days. And just to emphasise Matt's point about this isn't over, we expect these protests to go on into the new year, probably for several months to come. But it's also the concurrency of the protests that we're seeing. So we know that we have the environmental protests, Just Stop Oil. We're seeing smaller protests in a number of forces around asylum centres. So the Bibby and Scampton, all of which are putting pressure on some of the smaller forces and then their ability to provide mutual aid to the Metropolitan. And a lot of that is being either covered through overtime or additional resources that are being pulled from their normal shifts. So there is going to be a significant payback, but it's going to come. It will continue for months to come yet, and the true cost of this, I think, is yet to be really understood.
Thank you for that. It's perhaps a cheeky question to ask you, but obviously you're not the only emergency services on site during these protests as well. Do you have any idea about the impact on other emergency services, notably NHS, paramedics? People will be stood by the side of these.
So we work very closely with the London Ambulance Service and London Fire and the whole strategic coordinating group across London. I'm not aware of a significant uplift in demand as a result of these protests, but clearly, and your colleagues may have seen the fire service and ambulance service in Special Operations Room on Saturday, we have to work closely with them because there is an impact. Having 100,000 people march through London means that you can't use roads that you normally would use, means that you have to take different routes, means that congestion is worse. And planning that is manageable because we are well used to doing that, and we're well used to dealing with large events and ceremonials, and so it's manageable. But it isn't without impact. I'm afraid I can't say whether it's had an impact on their demand.